As we come to our fifth and final video, I just want to say thank you, and I hope that you've enjoyed everything so far. I hope that you've learned a lot, and I hope that this helps you going forward. So now let's get to introduction to chords. So to start us off, let's just start by talking about all the different types of chords that we can come up with. So when you think of a chord, you want to think of first a triad. So what is a triad? A triad is basically a group of three notes. So we can find these groups by starting with a note and then skipping and skipping again. So you want to think of ACE as a triad, BDF, CEG, DFA, EGB, FAC, GBD, and back to ACE again. So you want to start to see those group of notes and recognizing them as a triad or what will later be a chord. Okay, so now the different types of chords. So first off, we'll start with a major chord, and we're going to use C major for instance. So here's our C major chord. So if we count from the root note, which is going to be the note that the chord is formed on, we're going to have a third and we'll have a fifth. So now what makes this chord major is that between the root and our third, we're going to have four half steps. So that's one half step, two half steps, three half steps, four half steps. So in between our root and our third, we have four half steps. And now when we go from our third to our fifth, we'll have three half steps. So there's 1, 2, 3. So a major chord is four half steps and then three half steps. So just for an example, let's try this with a different chord. Let's take B flat. Okay, so first thing we need to do is go up four half steps. And remember that when we talk about half steps, we're talking about the distance traveled. So from here to here is one half step. Two half steps, three half steps, four half steps. Okay, so there's our third. And now we need three more half steps to find our fifth. So there's one half step, two half steps, three half steps. Okay, so you can use this to find any major chord. Okay, next let's talk about the minor chord. Okay, so the minor chord is going to be the exact opposite, right? So here is our C minor. So for this, between our root and our third, we're going to have three half steps. 1, 2, 3. And then between our third and our fifth, we're going to have four half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's how we form a minor chord. Another way to think about it is that when we start with a major chord, to get to the minor chord, all we're doing is bringing the third down half a step. Okay. So next, another type of chord is called an augmented chord, which for the purposes of this course, we're not going to use it anymore beyond this. So all this is just between each one of our notes, we're going to have four half steps. Or you can think of this as two sets of major thirds. Okay? And our last type of chord that we're going to talk about is a half diminished chord. So with this chord, we're going to be using all minor thirds or three half steps for each of our notes. So we're going to be using this one just a little bit. And I'll explain that a little bit more later on. So next, let's talk about chord inversions, or different ways that we can play the chord. So if we know that our chord is made up of the notes C, E, G, for instance, then no matter where we play these three notes, we're going to have a C major chord. Okay, so I could play this chord like C, E, G, and that's still a C major chord. Okay, so the typical inversions that we'll use are going to start with this one, which this is just basically just called root position. So if the root note is at the bottom, it's in root position. And so what we'll do now is we're going to move our root note to the top. So we have the same notes, but now our root is at the top, and we'll call this first inversion. So notice that our bottom two notes are a third, and then we have a fourth at the very top. Okay, so that's our first inversion. And then our second inversion is going to be this. So now we have our fourth at the bottom and then a third at the top. Okay, so these are the typical inversions that you'll have. So now let's talk about chord extensions. So with a chord, you're typically only going to have 3 notes, but we can extend this further. So we can add more notes, which kind of gives us a kind of pretty sound. And so these are called seventh chords because our distance from the root is going to be 7 notes, right? So we have second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. Okay, so now let's talk about the different types of seventh chords. So when we start with our chord that's just in the key of the root note, we're going to get what's called a major seventh. So a major seventh is basically the major chord with another major third at the top. Okay, so that's our major seventh. So the next type of chord we'll have is this chord. So this is called a dominant seventh. And we use this a lot in like blues music or some jazz music as well. And so with this chord, we can think of this one as a mix between our major and minor sevenths. So you'll have a major chord at the bottom with a minor third at the top. So that's a dominant seventh. Another type of seventh chord that we have is a minor seventh. So this one is basically a minor chord. So this is our C minor chord with another minor third at the top. This chord also follows our C minor scale. So all of the notes in this chord are in our minor scale. Okay. Another type of seventh is going to be a half diminished seventh. So with this type of chord, we basically start off with our half diminished chord, and then we have a flat seventh. So with this, we'll think of B is still the seventh, but we're going to flat it. So we have our half diminished chord and our flat seven. Okay, and by the way, in order to have a fully diminished chord, it'll have to be a seventh chord. So when we get to our 3-note half diminished chord, that's not going to be fully diminished. So what a fully diminished chord is going to be this one. So with this, you can think that we have a half diminished third, and for the seventh, we're going to flat it twice. So instead of B, we'll flat it once, and then we'll flat it twice. So that forms our fully diminished seventh chord. Okay. So now let's talk about how these chords work with scales. Okay. So just like there are 7 different notes in a scale, there are going to be 7 different types of chords that make up the general harmonic soundscape that we're going to be using. So basically, what we'll do is we'll form a chord using every single note in our scale. So if we're going to use the C scale, we'll form a chord first with C, then we'll form a chord with D, then we'll form a chord with E, then a chord with F, and then a chord with G, and then a chord with A, and then a chord with B, and then we're back to C. So these are going to be the chords that generally make up the harmonic structure for what you would use in a given song. Okay, so let's take a closer look at those chords. So as we go through each one of them, we can take note of whether it's a major, a minor chord, or a half diminished chord. So we'll start off with our first chord, and we're going to be using numbers, so that way we can apply this to any different key that we play in. So starting with this, we're going to be starting with our 1 chord, which is major, our 2 chord, which is D minor in this case, our 3 chord, which is minor, 4th chord, which is major, 5th chord, which is also major, our 6th chord, which is minor, and then our 7th chord, can you guess that one? Yep, half diminished. So our 7th chord is going to be half diminished, and then we're back to 1 again. Okay? So so when you're practicing your ear training, you're gonna want to know what each one of those sounds like. So that way you can use that to add some harmony to your songs. Or if you're listening to a different song and you want to figure out what they're playing, you can know already what it sounds like in a given key. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is by starting off just practicing the 1, 4, and 5 chords. So all of the major chords, these are going to basically be our main chords. So 1, 4, and 5 are kind of the main chords, and then the other ones, the minor chords and the half diminished chords, are just used to basically give us a little extra coloring. Okay. So after we do 1, 4, and 5, we'll add in the 6th chord, and then from there you can add in the other chords as you go along. But starting with 1, 4, and 5 is going to form our basis for what we're going to listen for. Okay, so now let's talk about if we were to use a minor key. Okay, so let's use A minor. So since A is all white keys, this is going to be the easiest to see. So so to start us off, we'll have our 1 chord, which is minor, our 2 chord, which is half diminished, our 3 chord, which is major, our 4 chord, which is minor, our 5 chord, which is minor, our 6 chord, which is major, our 7th chord, which is also major, and then back to our 1 chord, which is minor. Okay, so one thing I have to mention about the chords for the minor mode is that with the 5th chord, this chord can either be major or minor. So a lot of times you'll see a major 5 chord going back to 1, just because major 5 going to 1 always sounds really good. So you can use this in minor mode or in major mode. Okay,